flicker of candlelight, the smell of sweat and incense lingering in the private chambers of Whitehall Palace. Behind thick curtains, far from the eyes of his subjects, King Henry VIII's desires ruled with the same force as his iron fist. Over England, here, in the most secret rooms of the Tudor court, the body of the king was not just flesh. It was politics, it was prophecy, it was power. But what truly happened within those guarded chambers? Servants whispered of humiliating rituals, of queens forced into acts meant to prove their loyalty, of lovers tested in ways too shameful to ever be recorded officially. The rumors of Henry's bedchamber reached foreign courts, ambassadors writing in hushed Latin about what the king could and could not do as a man. Because in Tudor England, a king's sexual potency was not private, it was a matter of state. Henry VIII is remembered as the gluttonous tyrant who cast aside wives and severed England from Rome. But few realize just how much of his reign, the marriages, the betrayals, the bloodshed, was driven by something far darker: his obsession with sex, virility, and control. This was a man who destroyed queens, not merely because they failed him politically, but because they disappointed him in the most intimate ways. Imagine living in a time when your body, your fertility, your very ability to satisfy the king could determine whether you lived or died. For Henry's queens, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, the royal marriage bed was both throne and execution chamber. One night of passion could mean favor. One whispered rumor of betrayal could mean the scaffold. The Tudor court was a nest of spies, each waiting to catch the faintest whiff of scandal. Did Anne Boleyn seduce her own brother? Did Catherine Howard take lovers even after marrying the king? Was Henry himself capable of the acts he demanded? Or did his physicians and confessors conspire to hide his growing impotence with elaborate excuses? These were not idle questions. They determined alliances, toppled families, and sent women, sometimes barely more than girls, to their deaths. Tonight, we pull back the curtains. We enter the shadows of Tudor England, where the most horrific sexual practices were whispered of, but rarely written down, where the king's desire was law, and his shame became national crisis. Over the next hour, we will uncover the darkest stories of Henry VIII and his queens. Accusations of incest and adultery, the humiliating trials of young women condemned as unchaste, the perverse rituals meant to prove fertility, and the psychological torment of a king whose lust turned to paranoia as his body betrayed him. This is not the sanitized history of Henry taught in schoolbooks. This is the forbidden history, where politics, passion, and perversion collide in the most shocking ways imaginable, and the most disturbing truth. Even in their own time, many whispered that Henry's bedchamber was more terrifying than his throne. Power in Tudor England was not only wielded with swords, treaties, and executions, it was also wielded in the most intimate of places, the royal bedchamber. For Henry VIII, sex was not merely personal pleasure. It was a weapon, a test of loyalty, and a proof of kingship itself. In a society where lineage and heirs determined the fate of dynasties, Henry's ability to produce a son was treated as a divine mandate. The king's desire was the axis upon which the realm turned. Every touch, every night spent with a queen or mistress carried consequences that could ripple through kingdoms. His body, and what it could or could not do, became the most closely guarded secret of England. But with this power came obsession. Henry demanded not only obedience from his subjects, but submission from his wives. Catherine of Aragon endured years of humiliating medical examinations to prove she could still bear children. Anne Boleyn was rumoured to have lured the king with what he called her French ways, tantalising acts that, to many in the court, bordered on witchcraft. Jane Seymour, praised as pure and modest, was elevated precisely because she seemed the opposite of Anne's supposed seduction, only to die after finally providing Henry with the son he so desperately craved. Desire for Henry was never equal. Queens were not lovers, but vessels, expected to bend, to please, to produce. Failure meant disgrace. Whispers spread that he forced his partners into uncomfortable acts, demanding performances not for pleasure, but for dominance. What might have been intimacy in another life became proof of loyalty in Henry's court. And beyond the queens were the mistresses, those chosen women who lived in the dangerous shadows between scandal and survival. To be summoned to the king's bed could mean the rise of your entire family, but it could just as easily spell your ruin. The Boleyn sisters, Mary and Anne, are perhaps the most infamous example. One elevated, one executed, both forever tied to Henry's hunger for novelty. The psychology of Henry's control is clear. He equated sexual dominance with political strength. As his reign wore on, his body grew weaker, yet his need to assert power through women only increased. The less he could command physically, the more he demanded submission. His paranoia grew with every whispered rumor, every sign that he was losing control not only of his body, but of his narrative as king. In Tudor England, the taboos of intimacy were sharper than ever. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were crimes punishable by death. Yet in the very heart of the royal court, these forbidden acts were not only practiced, they were politicized. A single accusation could shift the balance of power, justify an annulment, or condemn a queen. Henry VIII made desire into policy. He weaponized intimacy. He turned sexuality into a tool of domination, creating a court where love was never love, only survival. And for his wives, what should have been the private sanctuary of the marriage bed became the most dangerous battlefield of all. But if Henry's bedroom was a chamber of control, what happened when it exploded into open scandal? That, as we shall see, would shock even his most loyal subjects. May 1536. The air in London was thick with tension, the streets buzzing with rumours. Behind the stone walls of the Tower, Queen Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, awaited her fate. Only 3 years earlier, Henry VIII had torn his kingdom away from the Catholic Church for her. Now, she stood accused of the most horrific crimes a queen could commit: adultery, incest, and witchcraft. The accusations shocked even hardened courtiers. They whispered that Anne had seduced 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, that she had corrupted them with forbidden acts, drawing them into her web of lust, that she had used her unnatural influence to bewitch the king himself, holding him captive with dark seduction. It was a story too lurid to be believed, and yet that was precisely its power. For Henry's court, the mere suggestion of incest and adultery was enough to destroy Anne's reputation. No evidence was needed. A few coerced confessions, a handful of suspicious glances, and the narrative was complete. The Queen had betrayed her king, and worse, had done so in the most scandalous way imaginable. The reality was far different. Most historians agree the charges were fabricated, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell to rid the king of a wife who had failed to give him a son. But the way the scandal was framed reveals everything about the Tudor obsession with sex and power. To destroy Anne politically, her enemies painted her as sexually monstrous, capable of unholy acts that blurred the line between desire and treason. The trial itself was theatre. Anne stood before her accusers, regal yet trembling, as a parade of witnesses repeated the charges. George Boleyn, her own brother, was forced to hear accusations that he had shared her bed, a claim so horrifying it left the court divided between disbelief and fascination. Anne denied everything, but her words could not compete with the spectacle. To the crowd, the idea that a queen might indulge in such forbidden practices was too scandalous, too thrilling to ignore. Even foreign ambassadors wrote back to their masters in stunned tones, describing Anne as a woman undone by her own excesses. On May 19th, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. She spoke of loyalty, of her innocence, but the shadow of the accusations lingered heavier than any sword. When the French executioner raised his blade, it was not just a queen who died. It was the embodiment of England's darkest fears about female sexuality. The scandal of Anne Boleyn's downfall revealed a truth more terrifying than the lies themselves. In Henry VIII's England, sexual accusations were the ultimate weapon. They could topple queens, reshape religion, and justify bloodshed. Anne's enemies had won not by proving her guilt, but by imagining her into a monster of lust. And the king, once her passionate lover, allowed the fiction to stand, for it suited his need to move on. But the court had learned something dangerous. If sexuality could destroy Anne Boleyn, it could destroy anyone. And soon, Henry's bedchamber would again become the stage for betrayal and blood. In the Tudor court, love was never innocent, and sex was never private. Behind every whispered affair, every suspected indiscretion, there lay a battle for survival. Mistresses, queens, and rivals were pawns in a game where seduction could alter the destiny of nations. Henry VIII's queens understood this all too well. Anne Boleyn had risen from lady-in-waiting to queen by catching the king's wandering eye, only to be destroyed when her allure threatened his pride. But she was not the first nor the last to learn that Henry's bedchamber was as dangerous as any battlefield. The Howard family learned it most tragically through Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth queen. Barely a teenager when she caught his attention, Catherine was paraded as a symbol of innocence and purity. Yet behind the palace curtains, she was haunted by a past she could not erase. Teenage encounters with men in her guardian's household, secrets that would be dragged into the light once she became queen. At first, Catherine's youth and beauty revived the aging king's spirits. She was his rose without a thorn, a vision of purity that restored his virility, at least in image. But soon, rumors swirled. Had she taken lovers even after marriage? Was she meeting courtiers in secret, risking everything for forbidden desire? When the accusations surfaced, they were catastrophic. Catherine was charged not only with adultery, but with deception for concealing her earlier affairs before marrying the king. To Henry, already paranoid about betrayal, this was the ultimate humiliation. She was condemned, and at just 19 years old, Catherine Howard lost her head to the axe. But Catherine's fall revealed more than a young woman's tragedy. It exposed the ruthless way political families used women as bait for power. The Howard clan had pushed Catherine into Henry's arms, hoping to regain influence after Anne Boleyn's disgrace. Instead, their ambition destroyed her, and nearly themselves. Mistresses, too, played a role in these power struggles. Courtiers whispered about women brought to Henry's bed not for love, but to manipulate him. Families schemed to place daughters within his reach, knowing one night of passion could mean royal favor, titles, or land. Yet these same women risked ruin if gossip turned against them. A mistress who lost Henry's attention could be cast aside as quickly as she had been elevated. Religion amplified the stakes. Protestant reformers condemned Henry's liaisons as proof of corruption, while Catholic enemies painted him as a moral monster. Every affair, every accusation, became fodder in a war of propaganda. The king's private life was no longer his own. It was a weapon wielded by allies and enemies alike. As Henry aged, his body failing, these sexual intrigues only grew more dangerous. Each new queen or mistress was not just a companion, but a symbol. If she pleased him, her family rose. If she failed, her family fell. And in a court where rumors carried the weight of swords, betrayal was always only one whisper away. The Tudor court had become a place where sex was currency and intimacy was treason, and soon, even the common people of England would feel the ripple effects of the king's desires. While Henry VIII's sexual appetites played out in the gilded halls of palaces, their consequences rippled far beyond the royal bedchamber. The people of England, farmers, merchants, servants, and parish priests, lived under the shadow of their king's desires. What he did in private could reshape their daily lives, their faith, even their understanding of morality. Marriage in Tudor England was never simply about love. It was an economic and political contract, and nowhere was this more evident than in the king's own unions. When Henry discarded Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn, he did more than abandon a wife. He severed England from the Catholic Church, plunging his subjects into religious chaos. Suddenly, ordinary men and women were forced to choose between their loyalty to the Pope and their obedience to a king who declared himself head of a new church, all because of his lust for another woman. The hypocrisy was glaring. For commoners, adultery was a crime punishable by public shaming, imprisonment, or even death. A peasant woman accused of infidelity might be dragged through the streets, her reputation ruined forever. But the king's own affairs, they were whispered about, yes, but tolerated, because his body was considered the body of the nation. His needs were framed as divine will, even when they contradicted the very laws he imposed. This double standard extended to gender roles. A man's infidelity might be excused as natural temptation, but a woman's chastity was non-negotiable. The fate of Henry's queens demonstrates this brutally. While Henry entertained mistresses without consequence, Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn were executed for supposed betrayals. Women were expected to embody purity, yet they were also expected to seduce, to produce heirs, to satisfy the king. It was a paradox designed to keep them perpetually vulnerable. Servants and courtiers were unwilling witnesses to these contradictions. They saw the king's frustrations, his humiliations, his explosive rages when a queen failed to conceive. They cleaned the sheets, carried the gossip, stood as silent observers to rituals that blurred the line between intimacy and spectacle. Some of these servants later gave testimony in trials, their words twisted into evidence of treason or adultery. In Henry's court, to see too much was to risk your life, and still the gossip spread. Londoners gathered in taverns to whisper about the Queen accused of sleeping with her brother. Pamphlets circulated, hinting at Catherine Howard's secret trysts. Even ambassadors, writing coded reports to foreign kings, described Henry's private frustrations with clinical detail. The most intimate acts of the royal bedchamber became public knowledge, fueling a culture of scandal that fascinated and horrified all of Europe. For the people of Tudor England, sexuality was a source of fear and fascination. It was policed with harsh laws, yet indulged in secret. It was condemned from pulpits, yet obsessed over in taverns. And at the center of it all was Henry VIII, a man whose personal desires reshaped not only his queen's lives, but the very fabric of English society. But what happens when the weight of rumor, scandal, and desire grows too heavy even for a king to bear? When excess leads to downfall and forbidden acts bring not only death to queens but crisis to a nation, that turning point was closer than anyone at court dared imagine. By the 1540s, the man once celebrated as England's Golden Prince had become a shadow of himself. Henry VIII's body, once strong and athletic, was now grotesquely swollen. His leg ulcers oozed and festered, filling his chambers with a stench so powerful courtiers covered their noses. He could no longer ride with the grace of a knight, no longer dance with the vigor of youth. His health was failing, and with it, his most fragile weapon of all, his masculinity. The court whispered of impotence. Physicians tried to soothe the king's shame with concoctions and prayers, but nothing could mask the truth. The mighty ruler, who had built his authority on virility and dominance, now struggled to fulfill the very role that defined him as both man and monarch. And in a society where a king's strength was measured in heirs and conquests, this humiliation was unbearable. It was at this moment of decline that Catherine Howard, his fifth queen, entered the stage. Barely out of girlhood, she was bright, flirtatious, and radiant, a stark contrast to Henry's declining body. To the king, she was hope restored. He called her his rose without a thorn, parading her as the symbol of his continued potency. But behind her innocent image, Catherine carried secrets from her youth, encounters with men before her marriage to Henry, youthful indiscretions that would later be twisted into damning evidence. At first, Catherine revived the court. The aging king smiled again, showered her with jewels, and declared himself reborn. But soon, the rumors began. Whispers that she laughed with young courtiers a little too freely, that she met in secret with men who were not her husband, that her past was not as pure as the king had believed. When these secrets came to light, they detonated like a powder keg. To Henry, Catherine's betrayal was not only personal, but public. She had humiliated him, mocked his weakness, and exposed the fragility of his declining manhood. Enraged, he ordered her arrest. The girl who had once been paraded as a symbol of purity now faced accusations of adultery, deception, and treason. Dragged to the Tower, Catherine Howard pleaded for mercy. Some claimed she cried out for forgiveness on the scaffold. Others that she declared herself guilty of being too young to understand the consequences of her actions. At just 19 years old, she was executed, her head severed in the same courtyard where Anne Boleyn had fallen years before. This was the turning point. Henry's reign, once fueled by passion and ambition, was now ruled by paranoia and cruelty. The execution of Catherine Howard revealed the king not as a lover or warrior, but as a tyrant consumed by fear of humiliation. His sexuality, once a source of power, had become a source of rage, a reminder of his weakness, his mortality, and the empire built on desire that was crumbling beneath him. From this moment on, the king's bedchamber was no longer a place of conquest. It was a tomb of broken promises, shattered illusions, and a ruler spiraling into darkness. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were not merely the tragic ends of two young queens. They were seismic events that reshaped the very foundations of England. Sexual scandal, whether real or fabricated, became the justification for political revolution, religious upheaval, and dynastic survival. Henry VIII's break with Rome began, at its heart, as a sexual crisis. His obsession with Anne Boleyn and his desperate need for a legitimate male heir drove him to tear England away from centuries of Catholic tradition. In a single act, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, all to nullify one marriage and sanctify another. The king's bedchamber had redefined the faith of a nation, but the consequences went further still. Anne's downfall, with its accusations of adultery and incest, taught the court a terrible lesson. Sexuality could be weaponized. A whisper, a rumor, a coerced confession, these were sharper than any sword. They could eliminate rivals, topple families, and justify executions. Cromwell's ruthless use of fabricated charges against Anne showed that even queens could be destroyed through sexual scandal. And when Catherine Howard fell, the same weapon was used again, proving that in Henry's court, no woman was safe. The cultural impact was profound. Ordinary English men and women looked on with horror as their queens were paraded as adulteresses and traitors. Some pitied them, others believed the accusations, but all were reminded that morality was not universal. It bent under the weight of power. For commoners, adultery could mean public humiliation. For queens, it meant death. The double standard etched itself into the social consciousness of England, reinforcing strict control over women's sexuality while quietly excusing men. Religion too bore the scars. Protestant reformers pointed to Henry's marital chaos as evidence that the old Catholic order was corrupt and powerless. Catholic critics across Europe painted him as a monstrous tyrant, a king who discarded wives like possessions and cloaked his lust in the language of divine authority. The very idea of kingship was stained with the scent of scandal. The long-term impact on the Tudor dynasty was devastating. By the time Henry died in 1547, he had left behind not stability, but chaos. 3 children from 3 different mothers, each destined to rule but none secure. The wars of religion, the executions, the paranoia of the court, all had roots in Henry's bedchamber. His desire for control over love, lust, and lineage had created a fractured legacy that would haunt England for generations, even centuries. Later, historians and archaeologists returned to the records, piecing together ambassadorial letters, trial documents, and gossiping court reports. They reveal a king whose private life was inseparable from his public reign. whose most horrific sexual scandals altered the course of history itself. Henry VIII's bedchamber was not merely a stage for desire. It was the forge of empire, the crucible of death, and the birthplace of a new England. But even after his death, one question lingered, whispered through the centuries. How many of his darkest secrets still remain hidden? History often remembers Henry VIII as the tyrant who broke with Rome, the bloated king who devoured wives and courtiers alike. But when we strip away the pageantry and politics, what remains is something far darker. A reign defined by sexual, scandal, humiliation, and the horrific weaponization of intimacy. We have seen how Anne Boleyn was condemned as a seductress, accused of incest and adultery in a spectacle of lies that shocked Europe. We have seen how Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, was elevated as a symbol of purity only to be executed as a whore. We have seen how Henry's obsession with potency, heirs, and domination turned his queens into sacrificial offerings on the altar of his pride. The consequences were not confined to the royal bed. They rippled across an empire. Entire religions rose and fell on the foundation of Henry's desires. Families were destroyed, reputations ruined, blood spilled, all because the king could not control the shadows of his own lust and shame. And yet, the echoes of this history reach into our present. Even today, scandals of intimacy continue to topple leaders and reshape politics. The marriage bed remains a battlefield of reputation, morality, and power. When a politician is exposed in an affair, when a public figure is destroyed by accusations of misconduct, we see the same old pattern. Sexuality wielded as both weapon and weakness. The Tudors may be gone, but their lessons remain. The most haunting truth is how little has changed. Women, in particular, still bear the heavier weight of scandal. Just as Anne and Catherine were condemned for sins often exaggerated or fabricated, modern women are judged more harshly than men when their private lives come under scrutiny. The double standard that Henry VIII enforced with executions still lingers in whispers, headlines, and gossip columns. But perhaps the greatest lesson is the danger of secrecy itself. The Tudor court thrived on whispers, on the fear of what might be said behind closed doors. The lack of transparency gave rise to paranoia, cruelty, and death. It reminds us that where power hides in shadows, corruption festers. As we close this chapter, one question lingers. How much of Henry's true sexual life remains hidden beneath the rubble of history? Did Anne Boleyn truly confess anything before her death? Was Catherine Howard guilty of betrayal, or simply of being young and reckless in a world that demanded perfection? Were Henry's own humiliations greater than we know, and covered up by servants sworn to silence? We may never know the full truth. But we do know this: Henry VIII's reign was not simply written in treaties or battles. It was written in flesh and blood, in scandal and rumour, in the most private of acts, turned into public weapons. So I leave you with this question. If you had lived in Henry's court, would you risk everything for love? Or would you have kept silent, watching queens fall beneath the blade of scandal? Because in the Tudor world, the bed was never safe. It was the throne, the battlefield, and the grave.